All right, folks, we're starting the broadcast. Let's just wait about 10 more seconds, let a few more people get on, and then we will officially begin. All right, everybody. Welcome to the Conservation Lands Foundation 30 by 30 campaign webinar. My name is Andres Esparza. I'm the Grassroots Engagement Director here at CLF. Thank you, everybody who's able to join. For folks who are going to be watching this in the future on our website, thanks for registering for this webinar. I want to start just like we've been starting most of our opportunities to gather here. During this time of COVID, we fully understand that things are a little hectic. There are a lot of pressures coming from a lot of different places. And if you are unable to join us right now, or you have to put this on your plate and watch it in a week or 2 weeks, we get that. Our priority right now is making sure that you and your family and your communities are feeling supported and safe and healthy. And when you're ready to engage, we're here to help you out and support you when you're ready. Until then, we ask that you take care of yourselves and your communities first. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really do appreciate it. For folks who are going to be watching, thank you. This webinar, Combating Climate Change Through the Protection of Public Lands, is one of CLF's big priorities moving forward. And this is our opportunity to not only continue the good work that we get to do as we protect BLM public lands for the biological and also the cultural significance that they hold, but also being able to protect them for the greatest causes of all, which in this case is climate change. Now, obviously, this is a big topic and folks have been talking about it. Right now, it's being overshadowed by a lot of other current, more relevant issues. However, as we look at the land that the BLM manages in our country and the role that we play as stewards and advocates of those public lands, we play a very large part in how we are going to impact our future through climate change. I'm going to turn it over to Danielle Murray, our Senior Policy Director, in a moment to talk about our 30 by 30 campaign, which she will explain what 30 by 30 means, and how you all as the Friends Grassroots Network and partners can play a part in working with our Bureau of Land Management to look at this massive amount of land that we have as a country, and how if we put that land to the greatest use possible, we could change the climate future of our world. This is very existential, big level thinking, but it's where we want to go, realizing that we get to steward these amazing and vitally important public lands. So there's going to be a lot of in-depth science, a lot of policy discussion, a survey for you all to fill out so we can see where as a network we're currently at and where our capacity is going to be at and what barriers we might face, and room for discussion at the end. So right before I turn it over to Danielle Murray, I would love for you all to take just a few moments and take your mouse and bring it down, bring the cursor down to the bottom of your screen, and you're going to see a bar at the bottom. I bring that up because one, there's a Q&A box. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them in there. I'll be managing that and making sure that they get brought up at the appropriate times. I might save them for later, but I will bring them up. As well, there's a chat function. I'll be sharing our survey through that, but if you'd like to chat with anybody in the room, go ahead and use it. For now, go ahead and click it and give us your name and the town that you're calling from. We'd love to see you all use that chat function right now as I turn it over to Danielle Murray. And again, you all are muted for clarity as we record. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand and I'll send a private chat to you to see what you need. For now, I'm going to turn it over to Danielle Murray. Thank you all, and I'll be on at the very end. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Andres. That was a great opening, and I really am excited to have this conversation today. I think we are facing a huge challenge with climate change, but I do think there is also an opportunity to talk about the places that we all care about, and to make that connection between 30 by 30, global 30 by 30 at the highest levels, but the places in the West and the people in the communities. And so that's really the discussion I want to have with you today. We are going to start off with the science, a little bit of an agenda. Here we go. So we're going to start off with the science, the concept of 30 by 30, talk a little bit about the theory of impact, how we get from kind of these global ideas of how to mitigate climate change all the way down to what can we do in the United States as it relates to public lands protection. We're going to talk a little bit about voter and political support for 30 by 30, or the connection between protecting public lands and mitigating the impacts of climate change and biodiversity. We're going to stop there and make sure folks don't have any outstanding questions. From there, we're going to move on and talk about strategy. What is our strategy nationally? And more importantly, what is our strategy locally? We have a short questionnaire that will help get your brain juices flowing on that. And then I want to hear from you and have a discussion on how 30 by 30 could advance your work. What are some of the barriers or obstacles you see? And the goal of this conversation is to come away with some ideas to put together an action plan so we can all move forward and advance public lands protection in the West. There we go. So the opportunity, I wanted to start with this. This is also the challenge. Climate change is an urgent and existential rationale for protecting landscapes, large landscapes in the West. And it also, because Bureau of Land Management is the largest land managing agency in the nation, they're going to have to play an outsized role. And we'll go through the science and some of the statistics that shows that. So here's where we really dive into some of the science. And I know there's a lot of information on the screen. Bear with me. I hope it's not too painful, but I think it's really important for us to kind of get grounded at a high level in what the science says. So starting from the left-hand side, you see global goals. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the United Nations body of scientists, released a report in 2018. And what they said was we need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This will reduce challenging impacts on our ecosystem, on our human health, and on our well-being. And to do that, we need to reduce global human-caused emissions of CO2 by about 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. And this report also highlighted essential pathways to meet this 45% reduction. Transitions in energy is important, land is important, urban infrastructure, including transportations and buildings and industrial systems. All of these are going to be really important. The one that we're really focused on is land. This is an essential pathway. And why? If you keep continuing to move over to the right-hand side, why is this an essential pathway? Well, land sequesters CO2. It sucks it out of the air, it holds it in the soil. We can reduce extraction and combustion of fossil fuels from development of our public lands. And the protection of land allows for human and animal adaptation. And this is a huge, broad topic. It covers everything from like global food shortage issues to protection of biodiversity. So taking another step to the right, in 2019, Science Magazine published a report called A Global Deal for Nature, and it's based on what the UN IPCC report found. And they dug into this pathway of land and found that we need to protect 30% of global land area by 2030, with a goal to maintain and restore at least 50% of the land area by 2050. So this ties right back up to we need to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees. How do we do that? We need to protect 30% of land, our global land mass by 2030. So all the way on the right-hand side, what does that mean for the US? And to date, we have protected approximately 12% of our US land base. So we need an additional 18% to meet the 30% goal by 2030. And so we have some work to do. But I think there's a lot of momentum around public lands right now because of the climate change crisis. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to dive a little bit more into the science before we move on to some of the voting and political aspects. So this is just more information on the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that calls for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This slide provides background on who makes up the IPCC, why they were created. It reviews the pathways to success, including land. And lastly, pulled directly from the report, it states that sustainable land management can contribute to reducing the negative impacts of multiple stressors, including climate change on ecosystems and societies. Seems simple, right? Protect land and your society, your ecosystems, and climate change are going to be mitigated. I'm going to provide links for folks after the slide deck. Andres, I'm sure, can send it out in any follow-up. So any of the studies that I cite today, you'll be able to dig in more later if you want to. So moving on from the kind of high-level global IPCC report and digging into more of the 30 by 30, the map on the left-hand side is from the study A Global Deal for Nature, which called for protecting 30% of our global land base by 2030. And at a really high level, this map shows regions around the world and the potential to protect various percentage of lands. It's not based on political boundaries, which I like seeing this map, but large kind of scale regions across the world. And it shows that, you know, while in the US we're only at 12% of protected land, there's potential. We have potential to protect at least 30%, if not more, in places, especially in the West and in Alaska. So taking it a step further, we know we have that opportunity to protect 30% in the West and Alaska. Now we're going to focus on how we do that and a little bit more on the role of BLM. And the graphic on the right shows what we all know. BLM is the largest land management agency in the nation. They manage 248 million acres. And they're going to have to play an outsized role in reaching 30 by 30. The chart on the left was put together by some of our national partners, and it shows one way we can meet 30 by 30 in the US. And just to be clear, this isn't the only way. The numbers could change slightly, but what this chart shows is that BLM is essential to mitigating the impacts of climate change in the US. I mean, it's a huge number there. And it's nearly impossible to reach 30 by 30 in the US without major land protections within the lands managed by the BLM. So this slide just furthers that point. The larger image of US is a study that shows the opportunity to protect intact landscapes and ecosystems. The darker red areas show the least human modified wildlands, connectivity opportunities. They represent ecosystem diversity and hotspots of biodiversity. And the small cutout on the left shows the BLM managed surface and subsurface estate. So you can clearly see this overlap. And again, this shows that the BLM lands provide an opportunity to protect important landscapes in order to meet 30 by 30. And I think we have to talk about the huge challenge ahead of us. And this administration has only made it worse. But even just last week, BLM finalized a plan in Alaska that would open up 7 million acres of previously protected lands to oil and gas development. So we have a huge challenge on our hands. Currently, 90% of the 248 million acres of land that BLM manages are open to oil and gas development, 90%. And while all of these leases are not active, a recent study showed that federal lands account for 25% of the total fossil fuels produced annually in the US. And a majority of that pollution is originating from our own BLM lands. So we know the basis of the 30 by 30 science now and what seems like a daunting challenge and opportunity, but we're going to shift now to more the political voter support. And, you know, there's good news. There's growing support for 30 by 30 in the US. Some recent polling was done by various organizations to talk about 30 by 30. And what they found was great. 86% of American voters support the 30 by 30 goal for land. 95% support protecting 30 by 30 in marine areas. And then 73% of voters, while it dropped a little, is still an overwhelming majority of Western states support a national 30 by 30 goal. There's also growing political support in Congress among some of our allies. Western senators and representatives have introduced a 30 by 30 resolution. Senator Udall and Center for Western Priorities have partnered to launch a Road to 30 virtual tour. And every month they travel virtually to Western states to talk about the importance of 30 by 30. And CLF is actually partnering with Udall and Center for Western Priorities on July 23rd at 12 Mountain. Here's a little ping for that, and I'm sure you will all receive an invitation. And our focus on that is going to be the importance of public lands in Nevada. Nevada has the highest percentage of public lands at 86% of any state in the nation. So I encourage you all to look for that invite and attend. And lastly, on the political side, on June 30th, which is just a week or so ago, the House Select Committee released a report, Solving the Climate Crisis, and it outlined a congressional roadmap for ambitious climate agenda. And the report had 4 major themes, similar to the ones we described below, pathways on how to solve the climate crisis. And this image on the slide is a screenshot of one of the 4 major themes, which focused on protecting land and water. And as you can see, the first bullet is protecting 30 by 30. So really, there's a lot of recognition that public lands are going to play an overwhelming role in mitigating the impacts of climate change and protecting biodiversity. And at a national level, we really see growing understanding of this issue. So before we kind of pivot to more of how do we use this science to protect public lands and some of the strategy, I wanted to see if there were any questions on the science or political support. Know that my background is not in science, so I probably won't have all the answers, but I'm sure I can find them for you, and we can make sure you have all your questions answered.
Thanks for that, Danielle. So far, I really appreciate that. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand. That would probably be the easiest. Or if you don't want to speak up to the group, you can type them into the chat box or the Q&A box preferably, and we can answer them from there. While you all are thinking of any potential questions, climate science isn't the easiest thing in the world. It's a little bit confusing and non-intuitive sometimes, which is what brings up a lot of confusion and honestly a lot of misinformation. And like Danielle said, we are not absolute experts in climate science, but we are pulling information from the best available resources that we know of. If you have more in-depth questions about this, there are a lot of resources we can visit online and other experts we can work with. We are definitely working with what we can do, and really when it comes to policy and strategy is where our strength is within the network to enact that science. So we have a couple people who raised hands. I'm going to go ahead and find you. And Chris Murrill, you are unmuted if you wanted to bring up a question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andres and Danielle. So I'm Chris Morrill. I'm with Cal Wild out of California. And I had a question just overall, you outlined sort of the numbers of acres managed by different entities. I'm curious, has that been broken out about what is percentages that are already protected? So in how much, what's the difference between the BLM lands that are protected and what percent needs to go, or how many more acres need to reach the goal and outlined in that table? And where those opportunities are by state too. So we work specifically on California. I'd be curious about what contribution each of the states, you mentioned the opportunities obviously are mostly in the West, but I'd be curious about drilling down even more deeply on where the opportunities might be. So.
Yes, Chris, that is a great question. It's something that we're grappling with right now. How do we show kind of the tangible next steps, look at each state and where there are opportunities? For BLM, I want to say it's something around 10% of BLM lands are in some sort of permanent protection, maybe more. In California, though, I think the percentage of BLM lands protected is 50%. So, you know, depending on kind of the parameters you put around those numbers, yeah, there are opportunities in each state. And I think the next step is really going to be diving into places, states, looking at those percentages and where we can make that kind of incremental change over time.
Thanks.
Thank you for that, Chris. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Shar Overby, who also raised her hand and had a question.
Hello, Shar.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Absolutely.
Okay. Mine is more of a comment and less of a question, but I was really struck by that a slide that describes the polling that was done and the general support for this concept being, yeah, 86%, 95%. That seems extraordinarily high given at least what I thought I knew about sort of climate deniers and people sort of in that other camp. But I find this really hopeful and something that, wow, we should really focus on this and just continually emphasize this support, because I don't know about others, but I was really struck by it.
Agree. And I think when you talk about 30 by 30 in a national goal is different than talking about places, right? And so how do we continue to make that connection? That if you support this larger 30 by 30 national goal, let's start talking about the places you can support too. And that's where I think the rubber is going to meet the road. But I do think that this is something that we can be optimistic about.
And Danielle, we had one more question. Thank you, Shar. From Rinda Clark. Does the BLM have climate change as part of its mission?
Good question. We're going to get a little bit into that in some coming up slides about the national strategy and how multiple use isn't working. There are some outside legislative policy overlays that the BLM should follow, and there's some litigation right now challenging the BLM that they didn't consider climate change in their administrative NEPA processes. And so we'll see what happens in that litigation. But so the answer is yes and no. There are some legal confines that kind of box BLM to considering climate change at least. And if they don't check those boxes, they're getting called out on it, and they might have to go back and do some planning. Within FLTMA and the mission itself, conservation is part of the mandate, but climate change is not. Okay.
All right. And we have one more question, if you don't mind, Danielle, from Shelley Silbert, I believe, Great Old Broads out of Durango. I might be mistaken. Shelley, you should be ready.
Thanks, Andres and Danielle. I just wanted to ask how you are defining protected lands, and then also what do we deal with lands where there is climate impact, such as the beetle-killed forests that are across extensive areas of public lands. I recognize that a lot of the carbon still stays in the forest, but we do lose a fair amount of carbon. And so where does that come into, that and other climate impacts, drought, and those other kinds of impacts come into the discussion?
Mm-hmm. So the question about how we define protection is also a good one. Right now, we're using national federal standards. I can send you the actual governmental agency and kind of the standards for which they use to determine what is protected. There has been some argument that we should expand that box to long-term administrative protections, to maybe wilderness study areas, which aren't permanent, but again, kind of have those administrative overlays. So the question about what is deemed protected, I don't think there is an answer that every one in our network and our conservation network would agree to right now. So it's an ongoing discussion, and I'm curious to hear what others think about what parameters we should put on that word in the future.
All right. That is all the questions for now, Danielle. I will go ahead and mute myself and hand it back over. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Okay, so now it gets a little bit more into the fun stuff. So as we all know, the focus on 30 by 30, we are in an election year, and this goes to some of the questions we just heard from folks. And we have a lot of national partners working with CLF, working with some of you that have been developing transition plans or goals for a new administration. And after 3+ years under a Trump administration, there are two overarching themes or realizations that are kind of informing these transition asks. One is that BLM lacks legal backstops and has too much discretion in determining what multiple use is. And this goes to the question of, like, is climate change in BLM's mission? So this kind of discretion in determining multiple use, even though conservation is part of multiple use, it's allowed this administration to exploit the agency and put in jeopardy millions of acres around the West. And I have a quote at the bottom from a legal paper, which is written by the former Chief of Staff to Secretary Jewel Tommy Boudreau and the Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals, Janice Snyder, under the Obama administration. And they spoke, this is about the BLM specifically, and what they said is that lasting and effective changes in the way public lands are managed, the kinds of changes that can survive swings in the political pendulum, would require Congress to weigh in on defining the public's interest in energy development or protecting for climate change on public lands. So this quote in this paper, what it says is what worked in the past, we've seen that it no longer works. And we're gonna need some bold policy changes in a new administration if we're ever gonna achieve the kind of land protections we need. Which is I jumped ahead, but is the second kind of realization, is that as we're working on transition plans, and we've really seen a lot of unity with our national partners, local partners, that we need to ask for bold transition and policies here. Maybe we can get some legislation through that helps mandate that BLM manage for conservation and restoration. Maybe we can do it first through the administration with a new president that really cares about climate change. And so these are the two kind of factors at play. And I will say that for the first time that I've worked on BLM public lands, which is not that long, it feels like a lifetime, it's been 11 years now. This is the first time I've seen such unity in the conservation community around focusing on BLM to be a better conservation agency and really trying to push forward bold policies to ensure the protection of public lands. So again, I am hopeful about that. And then this is what I think is the most important slide for us as a group is, what does this mean for local places? And I think if you look around the West right now, there's tens of millions of acres that are under threat to development, or there are campaigns to protect places that have just been stalled because they don't have an avenue in Congress. And the question that I keep coming up with is, if 30 by 30 is so important to climate change, and you have all these congressional leaders saying, I back this, and voters and support it, how do we connect all those that support 30 by 30 to the places that need to be protected? Everyone has heard of, the grand staircase and Bears Ears, and, we hope that if there is a new administration, those are fixed almost immediately. What about all the other places in the West? The Western Arctics that have 7 million acres on the line, or North Fork, Colorado, that it's opened up to oil and gas. How do we make the connection between the science to places, to people, to communities? And that's really, I want to get the folks on the phone, get your thoughts, get your feedback. And what we've done, and I think Andres has posted this in the chat box, is we came up with a couple of questions, and there's a link to an Airtable that's in that discussion box. And we're going to take probably 10 minutes to fill that out, think about these questions, and then kind of come back as a group and discuss them. And don't worry if you feel like you need to go back with your team and add more stuff to the Airtable later. You can submit as many responses as you want. This is just a good opportunity to take the time, because it's already scheduled in this hour, to really think through these 3 questions. And really they are, how could 30 by 30, or the connection between the climate movement and protecting public lands, help advance your organization's mission, the campaigns you have? And I know some of you are already working on 30 by 30 in climate, have integrated. Tell us about that. What's working or what's not? Another question is, what are some of the barriers you might face? I know, as Andre said, this is confusing science. Materials, are you going to have political pushback? Do you have capacity internally? So think about those internal barriers, and then also think about how, you know, CLF can help from both a foundation perspective, but also from kind of a unifying perspective of, can we help network together groups to talk more about this 30 by 30 and link together places? So I'm going to turn it back over to Andres. Maybe we can come back at, it's 12:30 Mountain Time. Maybe we can come back at 12:40, give people 9 minutes.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. If you go into your chat box, you will see that I put an Airtable link. If you could go ahead and click that, it'll take you to that really quick survey. Spend the next 10 minutes. I'll go ahead and turn off my mic and video in just a moment. Please come right back. If you need to do a quick bio break, if you need to just stretch out and walk around your office after you fill it out, go ahead and do that. And we'll all come back together in just a few moments. Thank you all, and we'll get to more question and discussion right afterwards. All right, folks, about 3 more minutes, maybe a little bit less here. So if you haven't filled it out, go ahead and finish that up. If you need a walk around, take a quick break, shake it out, go ahead and do that. And we'll come back here in just a few moments. Thank you. All right, folks, start bringing yourself back. Thanks for filling it out. If you're still filling it out, take these last couple moments to type in those last thoughts. Thank you all. And just a little bit of housekeeping, general stuff. I fully realize, just like all of us, we're starting to suffer from Zoom fatigue, and it's been hard to be on video all the time for all these events. We're going to start incorporating short little breaks into most of the webinars that we do, so that we can be attentive when we need to, but also take a quick break and walk around for 5 minutes and stretch out, so that we're engaged in the way that we need to be until the time when we can go back to whatever the new normal is going to be. So for now, thanks, Danielle, for answering that question in the chat box about Biden and 30 by 30. And that might be a question for later as well, is how does this play into November elections? But for now, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you, Danielle.
Yeah, and thank you. And thanks everyone for filling out that questionnaire. And really, I want to hear from folks on the phone. I want to hear your ideas. What did this bring to mind? What have you already done to incorporate 30 by 30? Or what are some opportunities? So really, I want Andres to come back, and maybe folks can raise their hand, use the chat box. I'm going to see answers later in the Airtable, but I thought this would be a great way to have more of a discussion around some of your thoughts and ideas.
And maybe while folks are thinking of them, one thing to think about is that a lot of the work that you all have been doing currently and historically is squarely in line with climate change work. It may have just been branded as something different. And we're asking who's specifically doing climate action work, but more broadly, who has been doing this type of work, and maybe calling it something else. Because as we move forward, we realize that this work across all the landscapes we get to work in is going to look a little bit different depending on what the community is that we're working in, the language we have to use, and how we're going to approach these issues. And the more we can get an idea of how folks have been successful in the past, it's really going to inform our success moving forward. So again, if you've been doing work like this, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll go ahead and unmute you, or go ahead and type a question in. And I got a Christian Canali. I'm going to find you real fast in my list here. And there you go, you are unmuted. Christine Canali, you are unmuted if you had a question or comment. If you're having trouble, go ahead and type it in the chat box, and we'll see if we can get that resolved while we see if anybody else wants to raise their hand and share what they've been doing.
Oh, you know what? I unmuted. I'm sorry.
There you go. Wonderful.
Thank you. I am so sorry. I just want to thank CLF for focusing everyone on this work. I think it's really important. The last 20 years, a lot of this land protection has been focused on land management plans, within, Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, National Park, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lands. In the area that the Ecosystem Council works in Southern Colorado. But management plans and getting that 20 years of built-in wildlife corridor protection, biodiversity, elevating all those jewels on public lands is essential. And then, of course, being able to recommend wilderness and actually have that implemented as, administratively recommended in the administrative plan. And then, of course, once that happens, to be able to take that elevation of land protection area, whether it's a conservation area, national monument, wilderness, there's lots of tools out there, but elevating that to a congressional level where our Congress people actually want to carry it. And of course, that's happened with the CORE Act in Colorado, which is being blocked right now, but I think it will be passed. But I think, we have done the research, and I highly recommend doing the on the ground monitoring, and that can be citizen-based monitoring, but to really get those elevated places connected on public lands, and then be able to educate the constituency about the importance of those places.
Thank you.
And documenting. Yeah.
Yeah. I think just because we have this overarching 30 by 30 doesn't mean we don't have to do the work, right? We still need citizen campaigns, and we need to talk about places. And you're right, if we can do that and then connect to our constituents, maybe we can broaden our constituents, because there's more people that care about 30 by 30. So even if you're not in Colorado, maybe we can get you to care about the CORE Act because you support 30 by 30. Maybe you'd all should, be out there advocating for the CORE Act. So yeah, those are the type of things that, we need to start elevating landscapes above from the local level to kind of the national importance of protecting these places.
Yeah, and if I could just, and I apologize because I know a lot of other people want to talk, but what I'm finding is there isn't really a lot of baseline inventory being done. And for me right now, I feel that's essential to really put together those baseline inventories of the critical habitat areas and make sure that everybody knows about them. I think that's essential. Because I think it's happening, that our public land managers are doing it, but their budgets have been so undermined over the last decade that it's really up to environmental organizations and volunteer citizen groups who care about places to be able to do that baseline inventory.
Agreed.
Thank you for that, Christine. And again, that's the power of a network of grassroots organizations. Is we here in Durango can't and don't know what's going on the ground everywhere. That's why we rely on our network to tell us not just what's impacting the land, but what does the community think and feel and say about it, and where can we insert ourselves for the greatest possible good. So probably talk a little bit more about strategies, but I think that fits squarely into why a network of grassroots organizations can have such a powerful impact. I'll leave it open for a bit and see if there's any more hands that get raised or questions that get put in the chat box or Q&A box.
I know we have some friends groups out there that are thinking about this and trying to tie this discussion into what's happening locally. So I know you guys are out there. Okay.
And maybe one more prompt, if anybody has brought this up before in their community or thought about it, has there been any, and again, we'll read this in the Airtable, but we'd love to hear from you on the call. Has anybody tried this before and gotten any sort of negative feedback or maybe positive feedback? We realize this isn't an easy issue to bring up, especially in the rural West where extractive industry is often the dominant workforce, unfortunately. But it is helpful data for us to know what has worked and not worked, and what has the reaction felt like as a community member. So if anybody has any insight for that, we'd love to hear it. We have Ben. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Ben. Go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Hey, yeah, so this is Ben from Western Slope Conservation Center in Paonia. You guys mentioned that our North Fork campaign that we've been working on, and again, really appreciate CLF's help through that. Thus far, our community has been working locally to protect the area for over 10 years. Like Christine was saying, in these land management planning. So I think this 30 by 30 movement really gives us an opportunity to just broaden our local movement to a much larger scale, and just kind of raise the awareness of everything that's been going on that we've been doing on the ground for 10 plus years. And I think that's really the great part of this movement, is just kind of making things more visible to people outside of the local community, and even like through Colorado, just raising the awareness of the North Fork and other landscapes that are working to be protected.
Agreed. And I'm glad that you feel that way, because I think that's how I see 30 by 30 right now too, is it helps take places that are so important that people are working so hard to protect, and it gives them another lens in which to amplify what they're working on, and another lens in which to talk about the importance of place. I never want the climate movement to replace the importance of local communities connected to places, or cultural, archaeological resources. There are values of public lands that will always be there. I think this adds another layer and maybe helps all of us advance our work.
And one thing to Andres, what you mentioned, one thing we've been working on that seems to be working well as far as our messaging goes is using kind of a just transition message, where we want to transition away from fossil fuel based economy towards a more sustainable, diverse economy. Again, centered around, you can have climate change in there, but also renewable energy and outdoor rec and things like that, so that we're not solely focused and reliant on a boom bust cycle of energy development, but have more diverse economies in our local area. That seems to kind of get people, get people's interest. So.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Ben. I think just transitions as a concept and framework is something that we hear a lot, especially coming out of Alaska. as we look at what does it mean not only to transition from extractive industry, but transition away from extractive industry in a way that, like you said, benefits the economy as a community, but also make sure that everybody is supported and it's not just the same people making money in a new avenue, but it's a way for real inequities to be addressed as we look at what a new economic future could look like for these communities. And I think that really ties in, how do we make this the most equitable transition as well? So that's a concept that we'll be exploring and talking more about as we move forward, is incorporating the idea of just transition. But if anybody's curious about it, you can Google it. It's a great framework with a lot of wonderful examples from all over the country to look at as how we can do it moving forward. So thanks for that, Ben. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Not seeing too many more questions. So Danielle, I'm gonna turn it right back to you.
Sounds good. Okay, well, this is just a wrap up. Again, this questionnaire, you'll have a link. Welcome to go back, take more time, talk with your team members, fill it out. It's really going to help us think about how we can, again, network our collective power to advance every single local campaign you're talking about through this lens. And just to thank you, my email's here, and they say in all the podcasts I listen to about social distancing and now being in all these Zoom webinars, you should put something personal in the end. So here is a picture of my family out on our public lands, not protected, but extremely important area in Colorado. So with that, thank you all for taking the time. I know we're getting back from a holiday weekend. Ping me with questions, fill out the webinar. We'll have a tape of this, and so you can share it with your colleagues. And I look forward to talking with everyone soon.
Thank you, everybody. You'll get a follow-up email. Reach out at any time. And like Danielle said, be safe and continue taking care of those important places you all get to live in. We'll see you all next time. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.